First, let's think about the fundamentalist side of this, right? None of us wants to be fundamentalists, and I just want to start by saying I don't want to be either, and I don't want to try and persuade anybody to be a fundamentalist today. And I think there are three big aspects of that we rightly really want to avoid. And the first one is we don't want to blindly believe our own culture or community. I think one of the most kind of powerful challenges that a Christian can hear, that I've heard to my faith, is when somebody just says, well, come on, though, if you were born in a Muslim country, wouldn't you be a Muslim? And I wonder what your answer to that would be, whatever you believe right now. What do you think? If you were born in a Muslim country or into a different religion or belief system, wouldn't you believe that? It's kind of an impossible question to answer, isn't it? Because you're trying to imagine yourself, like, what would I be like? What would I think if I had been brought up in a completely different cultural context? It's kind of impossible to imagine, but then that's exactly the point, isn't it? Because what that tells us is that the culture in which we're raised, what we hear from our parents, our schooling, the TV that we watch as kids, the stories that are read to us, it shapes so kind of hugely not just what we think, but how we think. And that poses a real challenge when our views and our values and our beliefs are different to other people's, because it makes us kind of ask, well, how on earth would I know whether my way of thinking is right or whether their way of thinking is right? How would we know? Isn't it the most kind of horrendous cultural imperialism or cultural arrogance to think that my particular cultural group has got somehow a better handle on the truth than all of the other groups? And for me, ever since I started sort of following Jesus properly about 9 years ago, this has been a real kind of struggle for me, something that I've wrestled with over time, and particularly while I was a student here in my second year, I had a real kind of crisis where I suddenly was massively uncertain about all of the things that I had been committed to for quite a while at that point. And I think on some level, the big question was, have I just been kind of squeezing the realities of life into this kind of Christian grid because that happens to have been the grid that I was given? And it's essential, I think, for Christians to recognize and wrestle with this, because it's obviously kind of irresponsible, and actually in our kind of global multicultural world, it's basically inexcusable to not be self-aware about the ways in which our beliefs and values are culturally situated. And of course, in that kind of global multicultural society, it feels very reasonable, very respectful to say, actually, any kind of dogmatic certainty about religious truth is misguided and dangerous. You know, everybody has different beliefs, and what we all need to agree on is that everyone's beliefs are equally valid, because we can't really know anything for sure about God. So everyone should just believe whatever works for them. In fact, I think sort of practically, day to day, how it works for most of us is that we have a kind of invisible line in our heads between the kinds of beliefs and values that are just obvious and are really important. And so it's okay to be confident about those things. You know, for example, beliefs like human beings are causing global warming, or values like everyone is equal and deserves human rights. We kind of think these things, they're obvious, they're important, it's fine to be confident about those things, but there's this invisible line, and on the other side are the kinds of things that aren't obvious and aren't as essential, and so we think, okay, well, with those things, we can't really know about that, and we should just kind of be respectful and open-minded in those kinds of areas. For example, I think anything kind of spiritual or supernatural questions of that kind of reality all tends to go into that box on that side of the line. But I think we need to be very careful, very self-aware, because that idea isn't neutral or universal in any way. It's actually the kind of one of the dominant beliefs of our Western secular cultural moment. And we need to be careful because that kind of thing has the potential to actually be one of the most subtle and insidious kinds of cultural imperialism. Back in the Roman Empire itself, there was actually quite a similar line. The empire kind of generously allows you to believe and practice whatever you want, as long as that doesn't, you can kind of fit those things into the very iron laws around the things that the empire really cares about. You can worship whatever you like, as long as it doesn't stop you worshipping Caesar. And as Western kind of secular people in a secular culture, we need to be wary of doing the same thing, of kind of laying down a strict orthodoxy on the things that we really think are important, and then kind of politely disregarding beliefs that other people think are vitally important but don't fit into that category for us. If we're not careful, it can be very subtle, very respectable, but a way of a kind of different form of that cultural naivety or even cultural arrogance that we rightly find ugly in religious people, and particularly religious fundamentalists. So whatever we believe, whatever we care about, this is a challenge, I think, for all of us. None of us want to naively accept the orthodoxy of our own culture. I think the second thing that we want to avoid is thinking that we're better than everyone else. This is pretty obvious, it's pretty simple. What seems so dangerous about religious certainty is the way that it seems to come with arrogance and judgmentalism, and people kind of looking down on everyone else. I don't know what comes into your mind when I start talking about that. For me, the first thing I think of is Westboro Baptist Church, the kind of allegedly Christian kind of cult in the US that they picket funerals and do all kinds of horrendous, hateful things. They do it because they believe that they have the truth, that everybody else is wrong and actually evil, and so they feel completely justified in the hate that they throw at people. But maybe for some of us, what comes to mind is actually not as extreme as that. It's just sort of slightly more ordinary, everyday people who just have a bit of that attitude in their relationships and in the way they talk about stuff that just seem kind of judgmental and self-righteous. They kind of look down on the people around them. And whoever we are, I think that attitude leaves a bitter taste in our mouths, doesn't it? None of us want to be that kind of person. And the issue is that obviously it just seems natural. Of course, if you think you know the truth about God and that everybody else is wrong about that, surely that would make you feel superior to those other people. And then finally, on the more kind of fundamental level, I think we want to avoid accepting truth claims that act as power plays that oppress others. This idea kind of digs a bit deeper than the first two, and it came from academics, theorists like Michel Foucault. Essentially, the idea is that what we think of when we say truth doesn't actually exist. What we actually are referring to when we talk about truth is just what the power structures of our society want us to believe. Foucault says, truth is a thing of this world. It is produced only by virtue of multiple forms of constraint. And the idea is that people use truth claims to kind of draw a boundary between us and them and to oppress them, those who are different. Whether that's the right-wing press doing it to migrants and refugees, or whether it's men doing it to women, or whether it's British people doing it to the citizens of the countries that they've colonized. And of course, this is exactly what a group like the so-called Islamic State does on the most kind of horrendous level. They claim for themselves divine authority to speak the truth, and then they use those truth claims to draw a razor-sharp divide between the faithful and everybody else who is the enemy, and to justify horrendous acts of violence against that enemy. And of course, they're not the only people to have used religious truth claims like that. You only have to think back a millennia to the Crusades, or even just in the last 100 years, the totalitarian kind of atheist regimes that have been relentless in their oppression of and violence towards groups that didn't toe the line of their version of truth, whether it's the Nazis or communist Russia or China or Pol Pot in Cambodia. And of course we think if that's what being certain about God does, It's utterly natural and right that we don't want any part of it. So that's the first side of the tension. We all want to avoid those dangers of fundamentalism, rightly so. But there is another side to the tension that makes it difficult, because there are a whole set of opposite things that we don't want to end up with either, and I think you could characterize them as apathy. I hope you recognize what I mean. So, firstly, I'll just get a drink. We don't want to believe our own community blindly, but on the other hand, we don't want to end up believing no one at all. Okay, so if it's we're trying not to be naive and to just kind of believe what our society tells us, the obvious alternative might be to decide that I'm going to decide what's right and wrong and what to believe from my own kind of moral intuitions, without listening to anyone from the outside who would try to kind of indoctrinate me. But the thing is, even just in the realm of morality, we can see very quickly that that doesn't work. So take the climate crisis. A big part of the problem there is we don't have an instinctive moral sense that tells us that burning fossil fuels or using single-use plastics is wrong. That's not a moral intuition that we have inside us. We live in a bigger reality that's all around us, but that we can't immediately kind of feel or see. And to know what's right, we really need to understand that larger reality. We need to listen to an expert in that larger reality, in that larger problem, and be ready to believe them. Otherwise, we have no hope at all of making the right moral judgments. And if we decide not to trust anyone who claims to be telling us about the larger reality within which we live, we are resigning ourselves to not really knowing what's right. We are resigning ourselves to sort of shrug at the ultimate questions of meaning and goodness and value. And if we do try to embrace that and say, well, I'll just do whatever feels right to me, I don't really know, so who am I to tell anyone else what's right for them, then that might, of course, help us with the second problem. It would kind of stop us, in theory, thinking that we're better than anyone else. But on the other hand, I think it would really push us towards giving up on making anything better at all. So I read a while ago about a professor from Rhode Island College in the US called Carolyn Fleur-Loban, which is a great name, and she was a cultural relativist. She was persuaded that it was culturally naive and arrogant to think that the things she felt were morally right and wrong were anything more than the kind of agreement of her own culture, and that there was no sense in which they were right compared to any other culture, because there's no absolute standard that you could compare them both to. And then she went and spent time working in Sudan, campaigning against female genital mutilation there. And very quickly she found that as she told people this is wrong, there were powerful, influential people in Sudan who were saying to her, well, we think it's right for these reasons. It's part of our culture. It's part of what we believe. It's part of the way that we think. We don't think it is wrong. And she was very quickly cast as a white Western imperialist, trying to impose her arbitrary cultural values on them. And she realized that actually her instincts, her deeply held moral intuitions about the equality and rights of women were not universally self-evident. And she had no kind of justification, according to her own philosophy, to say, this is actually true. It's not just me imposing my culture on you. But deep down, she was persuaded, she was convinced that it was true. You see, we want to be humble, but we don't want to give up on making the world a better place. And if we say we can't really know for sure what's right or wrong, then how can we ever fight for change in a society? I mean, can you imagine if William Wilberforce had said, yeah, I personally believe that slavery is completely evil, but I recognize that other people don't believe that. They believe differently. And I don't want to be judgmental or arrogant, so who am I to say that my beliefs are right and theirs are wrong? I should remain humble and therefore remain silent. Where would we be if all of the abolitionists had said that? Where would we be if the suffragettes had all said that? And actually that leads us on to the third part of the tension. We don't want to accept truth claims that act as power plays and oppress others, But actually, on the other hand, we don't want to surrender the power that truth has to defend the weak. Because, of course, if we declare that truth doesn't actually exist out there, that truth is only what the powerful want us to think, then we can't appeal to truth to challenge them. This is how the philosopher Alan Ryan put it in the London Review of Books. It is, for instance, pretty suicidal for embattled minorities to embrace Michel Foucault. The minority view was always that power could be undermined by truth. Once you read Foucault as saying that truth is simply an effect of power, you've had it. Now, if we say that there's no such thing as the truth out there, then we surrender the power of truth entirely to whoever can shout the loudest. If we say that we can't confidently know what's true, then we've basically agreed with Donald Trump's kind of alternative facts thing, where it goes, okay, you've got your facts, I've got my facts, we'll both tweet about them, and whoever gets the most votes must have been telling the truth. We don't want to end up there, because that is terrible news for the weak and the oppressed, for the other. There is, I don't think, any easy way out of this tension for us. We don't want a naive, arrogant, oppressive truth. But nor do we want to abandon truth altogether. And obviously, I'm here this lunchtime because I think that Jesus has something powerful and beautiful to speak into that tension. He has an incredible habit of just turning things completely on their heads and showing us a way through that nobody was expecting. So on your tables, there is a printout, there should be plenty, of the Sermon on the Mount, which is from Matthew's biography of Jesus. It's basically Jesus giving a summary of his message, his challenge. And I think the big question that all of us want to ask of truth claims is this: what does this truth do? What does it do to people? What kind of people does it make? And I think this sermon gives you a pretty good taste of, if I was to be a Christian, if I was to trust Jesus and believe him, what would that do? What would that do to me? What kind of person would that make me? So first, let's look at how Jesus starts, and let's notice what kind of claims he's making. Just sort of side note, the word blessed that he uses a lot here basically means ultimately, truly happy. Okay, so I'll just read the first few verses there. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Okay. So what stands out to you about these claims that Jesus opens with, these strange, weird, kind of beautiful claims? So one thing that I think is immediately obvious is that Jesus is confident that he has truth to tell us. In fact, the immediate response when he stops talking is that people are amazed that he speaks as one with authority. He doesn't do what I'm doing and kind of draw his argument from someone else's writing or from kind of common experience. He just says, "I'm telling you, this is the reality." And the truth that he claims to be bringing is absolutely not what we would expect, is it? You know, ultimately happy are the rich, the joyful, the powerful, the satisfied. Surely. Jesus says no. He says ultimately happy are the poor in spirit, the mourners, the meek, the hungry and thirsty for righteousness. These are not the assumptions of our culture. And they were not the assumptions of Jesus' culture either. In fact, I don't think these are the assumptions of any human culture left to ourselves. Jesus is bringing a claim that is profoundly counter-cultural. It turns things on their heads. It's a challenge from the outside. And you notice that Jesus expects that it will always be a message that is challenging, uncomfortable, inconvenient. He says it will always be a voice, in some sense, from the margins. If you look again at the sentence number 11 and 12, he says, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Do you see Jesus' logic there? He says when people live by and speak the message of God, like the prophets of the Old Testament, it's always a challenge. It's always subversive. It's always uncomfortable, because God doesn't sit neatly into anyone's cultural assumptions or anyone's kind of habits and patterns. God doesn't prop up anyone's cultural dominance. There will always be powerful people who feel threatened by this truth. And he says it's going to be the same with people who live by me and speak by me. So Jesus says to us today, if you want to avoid blindly believing your kind of cultural, your own cultural assumptions, if you want to avoid cultural imperialism, he says, come listen to me. Hear the voice from the outside. Hear the countercultural truth from the true creator of every human being, who's not tied down or answerable or from any single culture. And Jesus, of course, goes on to say that if you want to see that truth embodied in a human life, he says, look at me. He actually says, I am the truth. He says he is God as a human being. But wouldn't believing that we had received that kind of countercultural truth just do what we were worried about before, make us think that we were better than everyone else, make us kind of arrogant and judgmental? Well, let's take a closer look at who is blessed according to Jesus. It's the poor in spirit, those who recognize their own moral and spiritual poverty. It's those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. It's not the self-satisfied and the smug. And see how Jesus works this out in one of his most famous teachings. If you just flip the page over and look at the top right of the back page at the judging others bit, here is a stark warning to anyone who's tempted to feel self-righteous about believing the truth that Jesus is speaking. He says, do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way as you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. And then he tells this parable that just drives home the point. He says, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Jesus is puncturing and mocking all self-righteousness, all judgmental arrogance. He says, oh, you've noticed a speck in somebody else's eye, have you? It's probably worth just mentioning before you say anything to them that you have a plank sticking out of yours. You should probably pay attention to that first. Do you see what's happening here? It's because this standard of right and wrong does not come from you. It comes from outside of you. It comes from Jesus. He says you've got to realize that it challenges you at least as much as it challenges anybody else. In fact, Jesus says if you're going to listen to me, then you've got to assume that the thing that's wrong with you is so much worse than the thing that's wrong with anybody else. Jesus' truth is an essentially humbling truth. And actually, I know, amongst people that I'm friends with, and people that I've met, there are so many people who I know who are following Jesus, and it's actually making them like this. I think particularly of a mate of mine called Tim, who is passionate about what's right, what's wrong, about justice. He co-founded Carbon Zero campaign while he was a student here, and he lives it out. He lives it out with real integrity in every area of his life. But when you spend time with him, you never get the slightest scent of self-righteousness or kind of smugness or arrogance about him. You never feel judged. And it's because he knows Jesus. And that is profoundly humbling for him. And it also deeply motivates him to care about justice and what is right. and to make the world a better place. And it's a beautiful thing, and I love spending time with him as much as I come away feeling really challenged every time I do. Okay, but what about that deep suspicion, the third thing? Won't this truth claim end up acting as a power play which defines us and them and then oppresses them? Well, firstly, if you look at Jesus' life, if you just read one of the Gospels like these ones that are on your tables, you see that that is not what Jesus was like. Jesus set the oppressed free. Jesus welcomed the outcast and the ashamed. It's beautiful to read, actually. But it goes far deeper than that as well. Turn back over with me to the front page and look at the bottom right of that page at the bit that says love for enemies. So Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy." Now that's not a quote from the Old Testament. It's not in the Old Testament. What Jesus is doing is quoting the way that people had taken God's truth, love your neighbor, and used it as an excuse for us and them thinking and for hating them. But Jesus will not have it. He says, "But I tell you, love your neighbor. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven." Jesus says this truth is not ours to use to divide and oppress. It's not even ours to use against people who are actively cruel to us. Jesus' truth never justifies hate. Jesus' truth calls you to love your enemies. Why? He says, because that's what God is like, and you can become like him. And actually, Jesus didn't just say that that's what God's like. He showed us that that is what God's like. He didn't just talk about loving your enemies and praying for those who persecute you. He did it. Jesus actually loved his enemies all the way to death. And he prayed for the very people that were executing him. As they put the nails through his hands, Jesus cried out, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." Now, this is getting at the heart of the deep kind of mystery of Jesus walking willingly to the cross. He was dying out of love for the very people that caused his death. He was dying to love his enemies and to offer them forgiveness. And Jesus is the truth, but he is not the truth with a sword in his hand to divide and conquer. He is the truth with nail marks in his hands, arms spread wide, a bleeding offer of forgiveness to the world. He's the truth that sets the oppressed free and goes a step beyond that, that meets even the oppressors, even all of us in the ways that we hurt and oppress others, and provides a way to deal with their guilt, to forgive them and transform them. As it says in an ancient poem about him, by his wounds we are healed. He allowed himself to be torn apart so that we could be brought back together. We could be reconciled with God and with one another. So would it be naive and dangerous for you to become a Christian? To trust that Jesus is the truth? No. Jesus invites you to put your considered, confident trust in him and in his word. And what that will do is first and foremost lead you to admit that you are not brilliant and perfect and virtuous and morally righteous. It will lead you to admit that actually you're a mess and you've hurt people, that even you've hurt God, and that Jesus needed to die on a cross to forgive you. And Jesus invites you to be deeply humbled by that every single day, and then to learn from him as he helps you by Spirit living inside you to become more and more the kind of person that he describes here, poor in spirit, merciful, forgiving, gracious to others, hungry and thirsty for righteousness and justice, and loving even the people who absolutely hate you. Now, I don't think that is naive or dangerous. I actually think that's exactly what the world desperately needs. But I'm sure there's so many issues that are raised by this question. And so we're going to have a bit of time now for you to text in questions, or I'd actually love to hear them in person if you want to put your hand up in a minute. But you can just talk to the person next to you about what you think about that, and then I'd love to hear any comments and questions. Emily will pop up in a couple of minutes' time. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for your questions. We have 2 questions that we'll answer quickly. It's already 1:50. If anyone needs to rush off, please feel free to. So the first question is, how does this apply to activism? Take, for example, the US civil rights movement. How is it possible to pray for someone oppressing you without feeling that you know the truth better than them, and therefore they need to be prayed for? If this is the case, is that not the same as feeling a sense of superiority over them?
Thank you. That's a brilliant question. Am I on? No. Yes? Yes. Brilliant question. Thank you. Essentially, I think the challenge that we hit up against is either you're not okay with any kind of, any sense of the word superior at all, which means that you have to just sort of lie down and be apathetic about everything, because there's no such thing as value, there's no such thing as better or worse. You don't know anything that the world needs. Or you want to say, is there a kind of truth that doesn't make you feel that you are better? And actually, what Jesus does to people is bring them to a place not where they feel like they've mastered the truth and are therefore superior to others, but where they feel like the truth has mastered them. And they can't deny it and they can't ignore it. And like I was saying, the first thing it does to us is humble us profoundly and say, actually, I have in my heart the capacity for the kinds of evils that these people are doing to me right now. And that's what you see in revolutions time and again in history, is that the oppressed very quickly become the oppressors. And the message of Jesus says, know that you have that within yourself. You cannot say, I'm better than the person that is doing this to me, but you can say this is wrong. And I think that's really powerful. Thank you for that question.
Great. And the next question is, you present a convincing case for the existence of a, quote, Jesus truth that's not fundamentalist or apathetic. How do I know that a particular way of understanding Jesus is this truth rather than just a distortion?
Thank you. That's a great question. And how you understand Jesus is a really vital question, because, he speaks as this voice from the outside, but then, of course, it's so easy for people, for us all to start sort of arguing over, well, what does it mean when he says that, and so on. I essentially think Christianity offers actually a really wide, rich diversity of interpreters to listen to. If you want to become a Christian and understand what Jesus is really about and what it looks like to follow him, you don't just have white Cambridge students to talk to about it. You can read what 4th century African bishops thought about it. You can read what South Korean believers are writing about it right now. You can listen to an incredible cultural diversity of voices who are completely different in every kind of external aspect of culture and in their upbringings and their backgrounds, but who are remarkably agreed on the core essential truths of who Jesus is and what he does and how we need to respond to him. There's loads of other stuff I'd love to say. Please grab me afterwards if that was you.
Great. We have a final quick question.
Great.
From the Sermon on the Mount, how can the people that Jesus is talking about in the section about blessed is he who is, that part, how can those people be so happy when their situation is so bleak?
Brilliant question. And actually, I was at an event the other night that was a jazz band doing a kind of history of jazz and the roots of music in gospel spirituals amongst African-American slaves. And what was so powerful was the way that actually almost all of our kind of modern rock, jazz, soul music emerged from a people whose current reality was unbelievably, unimaginably bleak, but who had this deep hope that the bleak reality they were experiencing right now was not ultimate, that was not the final word, that they weren't the history and reality was not ultimately going to vindicate the people who were treating them as animals, that ultimately the big reality was that God is real and God is good, and God actually came as a human being to die like a slave, to die with the oppressed, and to turn things back the right way around, and that he rose from the dead because he had defeated the wrongness of the world. He defeated death and sin themselves, and that promise that he was going to come back and renew everything, right? They had that hope, and it meant that they could have a kind of deep down rooted joy that can be there at exactly the same time as utter agony, because you say, ultimately, the reason I hate this is because it's wrong. It's not just that this is uncomfortable for me and reality is actually bleak and painful and dark and I should just accept it and just give up. I hate this because it's wrong, and Jesus one day is going to put it right. And I think increasingly, even as kind of, for many of us, quite advantaged, successful Western people, increasingly we know that actually we desperately want the powerful and culture as it is today and the world as it is today not to be the ultimate, not to be the final words. We want there to be something beyond that can tell us this is wrong and it's not going to stay this way forever. Yeah.
Great. I've got to ask, is there anyone who has questions from the floor? Great. Do you mind shouting it out, because we don't actually have another mic?
So Jesus claims that nobody should view his or her own insight or truth more than they do, or more than anybody else. So how is Jesus able to claim for himself that he has found the fundamental truth?
Yes, brilliant. So correct me if I've misheard this, but I think the question was, Jesus is challenging everybody else's kind of pretensions to know the truth and have access to that, but he himself seems to think that he has this perfect access to the truth. How can he make that claim? Essentially, it comes down to Jesus' identity, and this is the drama that you see played out in the Gospels. And can I say, if any part of you is feeling like there might be something about this that is good, can I encourage you not to let the fact that it's kind of countercultural in our culture, it's a bit unpopular, it's a bit odd, put you off actually looking into it. Please do pick up one of these Gospels that's on your table, and the handout as well, and say to a mate that you know who's a Christian or somebody that you've met today, could we meet up and just have a look at this together and talk about it? Because actually it's worth looking into, isn't it? If we want to be open-minded, surely that means looking into it, seeing whether this is true. And as you read one of these Gospels, as you see the drama of Jesus' life, what happens is he does and says things that people more and more say, you can't say that, because what you're saying is claiming God's authority. And it kind of builds this tension to a climax where Jesus basically says, yeah, too right. I am claiming God's authority. That's actually who I am. I am God in human form. God coming as a human being to be with you and to reveal myself to you. He says, if you want to know what God looks like, look at me. And if the character of his life was anything other than beautifully humble and loving, we would just see that as complete mad arrogance. But when you read about him, when you see what he's like, to me it just doesn't make sense to think that he was a kind of power-crazed lunatic. And then he lets himself be killed, and by all accounts, he rises from the dead. And if that's true, then obviously it vindicates his claim to have this authority to be God in human form. If it's not true, then the whole thing collapses. And so if that's your question, I'd love to encourage you to kind of dig into the evidence for that, look at the arguments around how we can actually be consideredly confident that Jesus really did come back from the dead. Thank you for that question. That's really great. And can I just say very quickly that, like I say, I'd really challenge you to be open-minded about this and to pick up one of these Gospels and read it maybe and chat about it with a friend. But I don't know, there might be people here today who actually you've already thought about this quite a lot. Maybe you've come to other events or you've already read about Jesus a fair bit. And there's a brilliant G.K. Chesterton quote. He was a journalist. He said, "The purpose of opening your mind is the same as that of opening your mouth. It is to close it again on something solid." And I just want to encourage you, if actually you feel like, yeah, there is something solid here, I do know enough to think this is good, actually, and I think it's real. If you think, actually, maybe I could trust Jesus, that he's the truth, let me encourage you not to let that just kind of fade away, get distracted by term and by all the kind of things that are going on. Let me encourage you to talk to somebody about that. I'd love to chat to you if that's where you're at. I'd love to help you kind of think about what would be the next step for you. But this is true and beautiful, and kind of 9 years looking back, I can tell you this is the best decision you could ever make. And as I say, I really think it's what this world needs. So let me just encourage you not to kind of shrug that off if that's you. But I'd love to chat to you, or I'm sure others would as well. Thanks very much.